The laughter died instantly. Canon O'Brien's microphone hit the mahogany desk with a dull thud that echoed through Studio 6B. For the first time in 23 years of hosting late night, Canon had no words. The woman sitting across from him, Australia's biggest movie star Margot Robbie, wasn't smiling anymore. Her blue eyes, which had sparkled with humor just seconds before, now held something deeper, something that made every person in that studio suddenly aware they were witnessing television history. But this wasn't the kind of history anyone expected. It was a Tuesday night in November, and the late night with Canon O'Brien studio buzzed with its usual electric energy. The iconic blue and gold set gleamed under the stage lights. Audience members filled every seat, and Canon was in his element. His guest tonight was Margot Robbie, the golden-haired Australian actress who had conquered Hollywood with her charm, talent, and that distinctive Aussie accent that made everything sound like an adventure. Margot had just finished promoting her latest blockbuster, a survival thriller filmed in the Australian outback. The interview had been going perfectly. Canon's quick wit played beautifully against Margot's natural charisma, and the audience was eating up every moment. They'd covered her stunts, her co-stars, and the extreme conditions of filming in one of the world's most unforgiving landscapes. That's when Canon made the joke that changed everything. "So, Margot," Canon said with his trademark grin, leaning back in his chair with practiced ease, "filming in the Australian outback, that must have been intense. I mean, isn't everything in Australia basically trying to kill you? Spiders the size of dinner plates, snakes that can swallow a kangaroo, crocodiles that think humans are appetizers." The audience erupted in laughter. It was exactly the kind of observational humor that had made Canon a household name. Margot smiled politely, but something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Canon continued, riding the wave of audience approval. "I'm serious. You've got deadly jellyfish, sharks, dingoes that steal babies. It's like Mother Nature looked at Australia and said, let's make this place a real-life video game on nightmare mode." More laughter. Canon was hitting his stride, playing to the crowd, but in the guest chair, Margot's hands had begun to fidget with her dress. "And don't even get me started on the spiders," Canon added with exaggerated horror. "I saw a documentary once where this spider was literally big enough to catch birds." "Birds, Margot? What evolutionary meeting decided that was necessary?" The audience was in stitches. Canon's comedy timing was perfect, his facial expressions flawless. This was late night with Canon O'Brien at its finest, or so everyone thought. But Margot Robbie was no longer laughing. In fact, she had gone completely still. Her hands stopped fidgeting. Her smile faded entirely. She stared at Canon with an intensity that made him pause mid-gesture. "Canon," she said quietly, her Australian accent more pronounced than it had been all evening. Something in her tone made the audience's laughter begin to fade. Canon, ever the professional, tried to keep the energy going. "Oh, come on, Margot. You can't tell me growing up there wasn't like living in a nature documentary directed by Stephen King." But Margot wasn't smiling. She leaned forward slightly, her blue eyes never leaving Canon's face. "Canon," she said again. And this time her voice carried a weight that silenced the last chuckles from the audience. "My grandmother was Aboriginal." The studio fell completely quiet. Not the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for a punchline, but the heavy silence of 300 people who suddenly realized something important was happening. Canon's expression began to change. The practiced charm faltered slightly as he registered the seriousness in Margot's voice. Margot continued, her words measured and clear. "Your joke just erased 65,000 years of the world's oldest continuous culture." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Canon's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. In the control room, producers exchanged worried glances. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't how late-night interviews were supposed to go. But Margot wasn't finished. "You see, Canon," she said, her voice growing stronger, "when you reduce my country to a collection of deadly animals and survival horror stories, you're not just making a joke. You're perpetuating the exact narrative that has been used to dismiss and marginalize Aboriginal people for centuries." Cannon's face had gone pale. He reached for his coffee mug, then seemed to think better of it. His hands remained frozen above the desk. "The land you're joking about," Margot continued, "isn't just some hostile wilderness trying to kill people. It's sacred. It's home to the oldest living culture on Earth. My grandmother's people lived in harmony with that land, with those animals you're making fun of, for thousands of years before Europeans arrived and decided it was all just scary and dangerous." The camera caught Cannon's expression perfectly. This wasn't the practiced surprise of a talk show host dealing with an unexpected answer. This was genuine shock, genuine realization, genuine shame. Margot's voice softened, but her words remained firm. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about the rainbow serpent, about the dream time, about how every rock and tree, and yes, even every spider and snake had meaning, had purpose, had sacredness." She paused, and in that pause, Cannon did something unprecedented. He reached for his microphone and set it down on the desk. The gesture was simple, but it sent shockwaves through the studio. By putting down his microphone, Cannon was essentially stepping out of his role as host. He was no longer performing. He was just a man, sitting across from a woman who had something important to say. "I'm an idiot," Cannon said quietly, his voice barely picked up by Margot's microphone. "I'm a complete idiot." Margot's expression softened slightly. "You're not an idiot, Cannon. You're just uninformed, like most people." Cannon looked down at his hands, then back at Margot. "Tell me about your grandmother." It wasn't a request from a talk show host to his guest. It was a plea from one human being to another. Margot took a deep breath. The studio remained absolutely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath. "Her name was Miriam," Margot began, and her voice carried a reverence that made every person in that studio lean forward slightly. "Miriam Wana. She was born in 1925 in the Northern Territory, back when Aboriginal people weren't even considered human beings under Australian law." Cannon's face crumpled slightly at this information. "She was part of what they call the stolen generation," Margot continued. "When she was 7 years old, government officials came to her camp and took her away from her family. They said it was for her own good. They said they were saving her from the savage life." The audience was completely transfixed. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was education. This was truth. "They put her in a mission school," Margot said, her voice growing quieter but somehow more powerful. "They forbade her to speak her native language. They punished her for practicing her culture. They tried to civilize her by erasing everything that made her who she was." Cannon's hands were now clasped tightly together. He looked like a man who was understanding something terrible for the first time. "But Miriam was strong," Margot continued, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "At night, when the missionaries weren't watching, she would whisper the old stories to the other children. She would draw the traditional symbols in the dirt with her finger, then erase them before dawn. She kept the culture alive in secret." "How did she—" Cannon began, then stopped himself. "Sorry, I shouldn't interrupt." "No, please," Margot said gently. "Ask whatever you want to ask. That's why I'm telling you this." Cannon looked directly at her. How did she survive? How did she keep going after losing everything? Margot's smile grew wider. Because she understood something that the people who took her away never could. She understood that the land, that scary, dangerous land you were joking about, wasn't trying to kill her. It was trying to teach her. She paused, gathering her thoughts. My grandmother used to say that every Aboriginal person carries a map inside them. Not a map of roads or cities, but a map of stories. Stories about how the world was created, about how to live in harmony with nature, about how to respect the land that gives you life. Canon was leaning forward now, completely absorbed. She taught me that when you see a spider in Australia, Margot continued, You don't just see something scary, you see Grandmother Spider, who in our stories taught humans how to weave, how to create, how to bring beauty into the world. The parallel hit Canon like a physical blow. His joke about spiders being unnecessarily large suddenly seemed not just unfunny, but cruel. And when you see a snake, Margot said, you don't just see danger. You see the rainbow serpent who carved out the rivers and mountains, who brought water to the desert, who made life possible. Canon's voice was barely a whisper. I had no idea. Most people don't, Margot said gently, and that's not entirely your fault. For centuries, Aboriginal culture has been hidden, suppressed, dismissed as primitive. But Canon, it's not primitive. It's sophisticated beyond imagination. She turned slightly to address the audience, as well as Canon. My grandmother could read the landscape like a book. She could tell you what animals lived where by looking at the plants. She could find water in the desert by watching the flight patterns of birds. She could predict weather changes by observing the behavior of insects. The audience was completely silent, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of people waiting for the awkwardness to pass. It was the profound silence of people learning something that was changing their understanding of the world. And the stories, Margot continued, her voice growing more passionate. The Dreamtime stories aren't just entertainment. They're science, they're history, they're philosophy, they're environmental protection manuals that have kept the land healthy for 65,000 years. Canon finally found his voice again. Margot, I don't know what to say. I've been making jokes about your culture my entire career, and I never once thought about what those jokes really meant. Margot reached across the space between them and gently touched his hand. The gesture was captured perfectly by the cameras, and it would become one of the most replayed moments in late-night history. That's why I'm here, she said softly. Not to make you feel bad, but to help you understand. To help everyone understand. Canon looked at her hand on his, then back at her face. What happened to Miriam? To your grandmother? Margot's expression grew both sad and proud. She lived to be 93. She never saw her birth family again. They died while she was in the mission school. But she never stopped being Aboriginal. She never stopped carrying those stories. And she passed them to you. To me, to my cousins, to anyone who would listen. She used to say that culture isn't something you lose when someone tries to take it away. Culture is something you carry in your heart, and as long as one person remembers, it stays alive. Canon was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised everyone in the studio, including Margot. He stood up. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, addressing the audience, directly, we're going to do something different tonight. He walked around the desk and sat in the chair next to Margot's, abandoning his host position entirely. Margot, he said, would you mind if we spent the rest of our time talking about your grandmother's stories? I think we all have a lot to learn. Margot's face lit up with genuine joy. I would love that. For the next 20 minutes, Late Night with Canon O'Brien became something unprecedented. Margot shared Dreamtime stories about the creation of the landscape, about the animals Canon had mocked, about the deep spiritual connection between Aboriginal people and the land. She spoke about the sophisticated astronomical knowledge encoded in traditional art, about sustainable hunting practices that kept ecosystems in balance for millennia, about the complex kinship systems that governed Aboriginal society. Canon listened with the fascination of a child hearing fairy tales. Except these weren't fairy tales. They were the foundation stories of the oldest continuous culture on Earth. When the show finally ended, Canon didn't return to his desk. He remained sitting next to Margot as the credits rolled. Thank you, he said simply. Thank you for listening, Margot replied. The episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to soften Margot's words or minimize Canon's embarrassment. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with discussions about Aboriginal culture, about the power of comedy to either harm or heal, about the responsibility that comes with having a platform. Canon received thousands of emails. Some criticized him for being too politically correct. but far more thanked him for showing how to handle a moment of education with grace and humility. More importantly, the episode sparked a broader conversation about representation and respect. Aboriginal cultural centers across Australia reported increased interest from tourists wanting to learn real Indigenous history rather than just seeing animals and landscapes. 3 months later, Canon flew to Australia to meet Miriam's community and learn more about Aboriginal culture firsthand. The visit was documented in a special episode that became one of the most watched programs in late-night history. Margot Clark never forgot that Tuesday night in November. In interviews years later, she would say that Canon's willingness to listen, to admit his ignorance, and to use his platform for education rather than defense showed her what real allyship looked like. And Canon? He kept a small piece of traditional Aboriginal art on his desk for the rest of his hosting career, a reminder that comedy should lift people up, not tear their heritage down. Because sometimes the most important moments in television happen when the laughter stops and the learning begins.